I'm Jeff Kilday, and this is Croppies Down Under, a series of vodcasts that looks at some of the more arcane aspects of the history of the Irish in Australia. In this episode, we will look at an extraordinary event which took place off the south coast of Ireland in August 1920, when the Royal Navy hijacked the Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne, Daniel Mannix, from an ocean liner on the high seas, an event which Mannix later described as a victory for the Royal Navy that was comparable to Jutland. As the ocean liner, the HMS Baltic, sailed along Ireland's south coast on the evening of the 8th of August 1920, the lights of Queenstown glittered on the distant shore amid the glow of bonfires lit to welcome home Daniel Mannix, the Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne. Suddenly, out of the dark, appeared a pair of Royal Navy destroyers, and there, in mid-ocean, the captain of the Baltic was called upon to stop his ship. Soon a launch came alongside, and 2 naval officers and 2 detectives from Scotland Yard boarded the ship. They had come to serve on the Archbishop 2 orders, one signed by General Neville Macready, the British military commander in Ireland, prohibiting Mannix from landing in Ireland, and one signed by Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, prohibiting Mannix from visiting Liverpool, Manchester and Glasgow, cities with significant Irish populations. When the officer in charge requested Mannix to transfer to HMS Wivern, he at first refused, but after being formally arrested, he complied without further protest. As the Archbishop left the Baltic, a mixture of cheers and jeers broke out amongst the large number of passengers who had turned out to witness the event. With Mannix safely on board, the Wivern ferried the Archbishop to the southwestern tip of England, where he disembarked at 4 p.m. the next day at the port of Penzance in Cornwall. And here are some pictures of the Archbishop landing in Penzance. The landing place, evocative of comic opera, gave the wits a field day to parody the incident. One wrote a Gilbertian-style verse that ended, "For history shows no braver men in war or in romance than the captors of that gentle priest, the pirates of Penzance." Mannix himself had his own fun to the discomfort of the British government, telling a reporter from the Times, "Since the Battle of Jutland, the British Navy has not scored any success comparable with the capture, without the loss of a single British sailor, of the Archbishop of Melbourne." When news of Mannix's arrest became public, there was an immediate outcry that reached around the world. The Times called it a blunder, its Dublin correspondent writing that the proposed martyrdom of Dr. Mannix will put new difficulties in the way of a political settlement. The esteemed writer G.K. Chesterton, no friend of Mannix, concurred, telling the New York Times, "The whole Mannix affair is a gigantic farce in which the British government has played an extraordinary part, playing Herod to Mannix's John the Baptist." The Manchester Guardian claimed, "The government has made us all look rather foolish." Demonstrations were held around the world, including in Ireland, Australia, America, Canada, and England. Longshoremen in New York refused to work on British ships in protest over Mannix. 10 members of the Australasian Catholic hierarchy who were in the UK on their way home from Rome lodged a protest against the treatment of Archbishop Mannix, describing it as an indignity to us, his brothers, as well as to the whole Catholic body, both priests and people of Australia and New Zealand. 27 Irish bishops also protested. So what was it that led the British government to risk ridicule and international opprobrium by hijacking an Australian Catholic bishop from an ocean liner on the high seas in order to prevent him from landing in his native country? Before answering that question, let me give you some background information on the Irish in Australia and on Archbishop Daniel Mannix. Australia is arguably the most Irish country outside of Ireland. more so than the United States. From Ireland's point of view, Australia was not a major emigration destination in the 19th century, with only about 5% of Irish emigrants going there. But from Australia's point of view, Ireland was very significant, with about a quarter of Australia's immigrants coming from Ireland, most of them from the south and the west, so that about 85% of Irish immigrants coming to Australia were Catholics. Consequently, the ethno-religious rivalry between Catholic Ireland and Protestant Britain, which had existed for centuries, found its way from the old world to the new, becoming endemic. For the most part, it simmered below the surface, but every now and then it would bubble up and boil over, sometimes around the 12th of July, as in Melbourne in 1846, when shots were fired, or on St. Patrick's Day, as in Sydney in 1878, when rioting broke out. But the conflict was mostly rhetorical, erupting particularly when the Irish in Ireland stepped up their campaign for self-government, such as during the debates over Home Rule and land reform in the 1880s, or following the Easter Rising of 1916, and during the Irish War of Independence. Debates about Ireland often became entangled with local issues, such as the Catholic campaign for state aid for its schools, and the Australian government's plans in 1916 and 1917 to introduce conscription, which many Irish Australians fervently opposed. Australia emerged from the First World War a country deeply divided along religious, ethnic, and class lines. The outbreak of the Irish War of Independence in 1919 and its escalation in 1920, following the introduction of the Black and Tans, served to widen those divisions as Australians became vicariously involved. The increasing ferocity of the struggle in Ireland was reflected in the intensification of local sectarian conflicts. The British Protestant majority and the Irish Catholic minority increasingly defined their relative positions by reference to the struggle in Ireland. The worsening situation in Ireland, combined with a series of local events, led to what the New South Wales Attorney General Edward McTiernan described at the end of 1920 as a veritable hurricane of sectarian strife. So it was in this context that Archbishop Mannix set out on his overseas trip. The principal character in this fascinating story is, of course, Daniel Mannix. Born near Charleville, County Cork in 1864, Mannix was ordained a priest in 1890 after serving as Vice President and then President of Maynooth College from 1903 to 1912. He was consecrated an Archbishop and then was sent to Australia. In March 1913, he arrived in Melbourne as coadjutor to Archbishop Thomas Carr, whom he succeeded 4 years later in May 1917. Although Mannix had been regarded in Ireland as a conservative on the national issue, in Australia he became identified as a radical. Unlike many of the bishops in Australia and Ireland, he refused to condemn the rebels who took part in the Easter Rising. And in 1921-22, he was the only member of the Australian hierarchy to oppose the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Following his arrival in Melbourne, Mannix resided in a working-class parish, and some historians argue that he was radicalised there by Irish working-class Catholics with whom he strongly and publicly identified. Mannix rose to prominence in his new country during the First World War, particularly during the conscription campaigns of 1916 and 1917, when he publicly opposed the government's plans to introduce conscription for overseas military service, arguing that Australia had done enough. He also questioned the justice of the war, describing it as an ordinary trade war. His outspokenness was met with accusations that he was disloyal to the British Empire and was pro-German. His profile was lifted to the national stage by the invective which Prime Minister Billy Hughes heaped upon him. Hughes claimed that Mannix preached sedition in season and out of season. Although beloved by many Australian Catholics of Irish descent, particularly those of the working class, he was despised by the majority Protestant community and as well by many well-off Catholics who rejected his abrasive approach to the causes he advocated. Loyalist Australians called on the government to deport him, which it declined to do for fear of a backlash by Irish Catholic voters. After the war, accusations of disloyalty against Mannix did not abate, for Mannix had become a leading advocate of Irish self-determination. So now let us return to Mannix's overseas trip that became so controversial that hot August night. Mannix left Australia on the 19th of May 1920 en route to Rome for his first report to the Pope on the state of his diocese. Mannix planned to spend some time travelling through the United States and Canada to New York, and from there he would cross the Atlantic and disembark at Queenstown to visit his family in Charleville, and in particular his 89-year-old mother. From there he planned to travel through England and on to Rome. For an ordinary bishop, in ordinary times, such a journey would have been unremarkable. But Mannix was no ordinary bishop, and the times were far from ordinary. In the words of one Mannix biographer, Frank Murphy, the journey was destined to be so full of incident that the attention of the world was focused upon him and his name. Fame and utterance were given a universal publicity that they had never known before. When Mannix commenced his journey in May 1920, he was at the height of his notoriety in Australia, having just a few weeks before been escorted during the St. Patrick's Day parade by an honour guard of 14 Victoria Cross recipients on white horses, followed by 10,000 ex-servicemen in uniform. And let's have a look at a short movie clip of that parade. Now here we can see at the top of the picture, Mannix's car surrounded by his Victoria Cross recipients on their white horses. See the numbers of people lining the streets to view the parade. And then here we have the start of the 10,000 Irish Australians in uniform. So let's go back. Now, this was a typical Mannix-style staged event to send a message to the Australian government and people that despite claims to the contrary, Australia's Irish Catholics had been loyal to Australia and to the Empire during the war. The parade was filmed, and the film footage plus still images of Ireland's revolutionary heroes were combined into a movie called Ireland Will Be Free that was distributed around Australia, much to the delight of Irish Catholics and the protests of British Protestants. So popular was Mannix among his supporters that his departure from Melbourne to Sydney to board the ship to America had to be put back 2 days because the crowd which turned out in Melbourne to farewell him was so large it delayed his progress, causing him to miss the Sydney train. When he eventually arrived in Sydney, thousands turned out there to wish him bon voyage as he embarked on the SS Ventura, bound for San Francisco. After 7 tumultuous years in Australia, Mannix no doubt looked forward to a relaxing 2.5-week voyage to America, away from the sectarian tensions then gripping Australia. If so, he was to be disappointed, for his notoriety preceded him. Some passengers on the Ventura, knowing very well who their fellow traveller was, were determined to show their displeasure at the traitor in their midst, which they did by provoking incidents intended to embarrass the Archbishop in American eyes. During the crossing of the line celebrations, a group of passengers came up behind the Archbishop and sang "God Save the King" to see whether he would stand. Mannix ignored them. Later, when the Ventura was preparing to depart Honolulu Harbour, a band stationed on the wharf played a number of tunes to farewell the vessel, including the American national anthem. To the consternation of a fellow passenger, Marcellus Parsons of New York, the Archbishop and his party did not stand during the playing of the anthem. From the ship, Parsons sent a telegram signed by 11 Americans to the Secretary of State complaining of the Archbishop's misconduct. Parsons later lodged with the Immigration Bureau of the State Department a protest against the admission of Mannix to the United States and requested that he be deported. News of the allegation soon appeared in American and international newspapers. Parsons told the New York World that he had approached Dr. Mannix and had asked him whether he realised the band was playing the American anthem. According to Parsons, Mannix answered in the affirmative. Parsons then said, "Well, why didn't you stand?" To which Mannix is said to have replied that he did not care to. Garbled press reports of Mannix's response to the controversy were not helpful. One newspaper reported, "Archbishop Mannix said he believed the Star-Spangled Banner was an English anthem because he thought he heard Englishmen singing it, and he therefore declined to stand." In San Francisco, the California branch of the Sons of Irish Freedom attempted to quell the controversy by issuing a statement with the Archbishop's approval, denying the allegation and claiming that Dr. Mannix and his party did stand during the American anthem. Despite Parsons' attempt to embarrass Mannix in the eyes of Americans, the Irish Americans warmly welcomed the Archbishop in San Francisco, as they did during his 6 weeks journey across America to New York, during which he addressed successful meetings of sympathisers in a number of towns and cities. But the controversy didn't go away. Parsons' allegations were repeated in the press shortly before Mannix arrived in New York. The New York Times described Mannix as the prelate who is said to have refused to stand when the Star-Spangled Banner was sung on shipboard. In a further attempt to defuse the issue, Mannix's secretary, Father Arthur Vaughan, went to New York in advance of the Archbishop and gave reporters a more detailed account of the incident, though one not totally consistent with the earlier denial. According to Vaughan, Mannix did remain seated during the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner, but he did so because he did not know that the music, which he had heard but faintly, was that of the American national anthem. Vaughan explained to reporters, "It's all a plot. Efforts were made to discredit His Grace in Australia and also on the Ventura. The incident in Honolulu Harbour was the culmination of a number of happenings." The anthem incident was a storm in a teacup, but the British Foreign Office regarded it seriously enough to monitor the situation, and the US State Department instituted an inquiry, and immigration officials felt compelled to issue a statement declaring there was no law under which Mannix could be excluded from the United States, even if the inquiry disclosed he had failed to stand during the playing of the anthem. This trivial incident serves to demonstrate how easily Archbishop Mannix could stir up controversy and arouse passions on both sides, a phenomenon of which the British government was well aware from his actions in Australia during the war. Hence, the Foreign Office, already sensitive to the impact of the situation in Ireland on Anglo-American relations, kept a close watch on Mannix's activities in America. But were British concerns justified? After all, Archbishop Mannix was a senior churchman who had entertained royalty at Maynooth College, not once but twice. First in July 1903, when King Edward VII visited, and Mannix was vice president then, and second in July 1911, when King George V visited and Mannix was president. A Mannix biographer, James Griffin, has written that Mannix was then considered a castle Catholic, who had allegedly engineered the dismissal of Professor Michael O'Hickey, a leading proponent of the Irish language, and that the Irish revolutionary leader, Patrick Pearse, once asked, "Is Mannix an enemy to Irish nationalism?" But that was then. In 1920, the British government's concerns were of much more recent origin. The British authorities were far from convinced that the purpose of Archbishop Mannix's intended visit to Ireland was to visit his mum. To them, Mannix was a troublemaker who would use his fiery rhetoric to whip up anti-government feeling. For example, in one speech in America, Mannix said, "I will consider it my duty to kneel at the graves of the leaders executed in 1916 and thank them for what they have done for my country." General Macready described Mannix as a turbulent priest and later wrote that his appearance in Ireland would have resulted in increased bloodshed. Nevertheless, although the British cabinet considered that speeches which Mannix had made in Australia were violently anti-British, on the 24th of June, it rejected a recommendation that he be prevented from landing in Ireland, fearing its effect on public opinion. The cabinet's view hardened, however, when it received reports of speeches Mannix was giving in America, speeches which David Lloyd George later described as extremely mischievous. For like Charles Stewart Parnell 40 years before, Mannix said things to his American audience that he did not say at home. According to historian Colm Kiernan, what fanned Mannix's radicalism was his meeting with De Valera in Omaha, where they both spoke from the same platform. But Mannix's outspokenness in America also reflected the fact that in Australia, the sedition laws circumscribed what Mannix could say about the Irish cause without risking prosecution. Today, it seems unbelievable that a person in Australia could be prosecuted for advocating an Irish republic. But in the early post-war years, the Hughes government continued to use wartime powers to silence its opponents, including prosecuting those who criticised British rule in Ireland. Consequently, in Australia, Mannix and other leading supporters of Sinn Féin did not openly advocate a republic for Ireland. Following the Easter Rising, the Australian Irish generally continued to support Home Rule. But after the collapse of the Home Rule movement in Ireland in 1918 and the victory of Sinn Féin at the general elections in December that year, the Irish in Australia increasingly advocated self-determination for Ireland. At the Irish Race Convention in Melbourne in November 1919, attended by 2,000 delegates representing a wide range of Irish opinion in Australia, including no less than 15 bishops and archbishops, a resolution was passed affirming the right of the people of Ireland to choose their own form of government. This formula was adopted to satisfy both Republicans and Home Rulers. Addressing the convention, Mannix said that they were there to support Ireland's claim as expressed at the last general election in Ireland and to support her chosen leader, Eamon de Valera, especially now when self-determination, which was really Sinn Féinism, was on everybody's lips. Now, one might read into those words that Mannix was in fact advocating that Ireland become an independent republic, but he was careful not to say so expressly. Perhaps this was to avoid prosecution, but also because many of the delegates were still Home Rulers who did not support an Irish republic. In any event, the constraints in Australia on what might be said in support of the Irish cause did not apply in America. After all, not only was the United States a republic, it was also a republic established following a war of independence fought against the British. Consequently, Mannix took the opportunity to speak his mind now that the muzzle was off. A few days before arriving in New York City, Mannix spoke at the Catholic summer school at Cliff Haven near Plattsburgh in New York State, where he delivered a fiery speech in which, according to the report in the Times of London, he denounced England as the perpetual enemy of the United States and demanded American recognition of Sinn Féin. After telling his audience, his American audience, that Ireland was ruled by an alien government, Mannix continued, "England never was a friend of the United States. When your fathers fought, it was against England. Ireland has the same grievance against the same enemy, only 10 times greater. I hope Ireland will make a fight equally successful. England was your enemy. England is your enemy today. England will be your enemy for all time." The next day, the Times condemned Mannix's bitter and provocative speech and questioned whether it was conceivably justifiable for the Archbishop of Melbourne to employ the Irish question in an effort to embroil Great Britain with a friendly nation and former comrade in arms. Father Ebsworth, another Mannix biographer who wrote a generally sympathetic biography, criticised Mannix's Cliffhaven speech as entering the pathless realms of international politics, a world of intrigue that by no stretch of the imagination can be classed as his concern. On his arrival in New York City on the 17th of July, Mannix used the R word, telling reporters, "I am altogether in favour of the Irish Republic. I cannot understand how anybody who sincerely held to the principles that all of us seem to be proclaiming during the war can now fail to support the Irish Republic." But it was not only Mannix's intemperate language that concerned the British government. Mannix and De Valera made a number of appearances together in New York, and the enthusiastic reaction which Mannix received from his Irish-American hosts would have confirmed in their minds the danger his oratory posed were he to go to Ireland. At one such event, Mannix was the guest of honour along with De Valera at a mass meeting in New York's Madison Square Garden. 15,000 sympathisers crowded into the auditorium, with thousands more outside. The Archbishop addressed them on British usurpation of authority in Ireland for the last 750 years. The next day, the Mayor of New York, John Hyland, conferred on Mannix the freedom of the city. Mannix even attended a baseball match and was given the honour of tossing the ball in. The issue of Mannix's proposed visit to Ireland was raised in the House of Commons, and the Lord Privy Seal, Andrew Bonar Law, replying to a question, informed the House that the matter was under review. 4 days later, on the 23rd of July, the Foreign Office instructed its Consul General in New York to inform Archbishop Mannix that the government had decided that he would not be permitted to land in Ireland. The next day, the Consul General sent a special delivery letter to Mannix, advising of the government's decision. And on the 26th of July, Lloyd George informed the House of the decision. Mannix was not fazed. 3 days later, he publicly announced that he would be sailing to Ireland on the Baltic, which was leaving the next day at noon. He told a delegation from the American Irish Historical Society, "I am willing to go to prison, even to be put in chains for the cause of Ireland's freedom." The propensity for Mannix to cause division between his supporters and detractors was demonstrated once again as the Baltic was preparing to sail. The ship's cooks and stewards threatened to go on strike if Mannix came aboard, and its firemen threatened to go on strike if Mannix were not allowed to board. The impasse was resolved when the cooks and stewards took the advice of the chief steward to leave the matter to the British government. But that was not the end of the strife. As reported in the New York Times, the departure of the Baltic was marked by disorders, rarely if ever equalled, at an American transatlantic passenger pier. There were hisses, cheers, fistfights, and the flash of revolvers, as a crowd of about 5,000 supporters and opponents waving flags and placards gathered at the pier to farewell the Archbishop. A letter to the New York Times, signed by Australian ex-servicemen living in New York, concluded, there is one tribute that Australia pays to the departing prelate wholeheartedly. For sowing discord in communities where peace reigned before, he has no peer. If that is his apparent purpose, it must be admitted he succeeds well. Officials in London took steps to ensure that the government's decision to bar Mannix from Ireland could not be thwarted by stealth. The cabinet was told that Atlantic liners had been instructed not to stop at Queenstown. But diverting the Baltic to its final destination, Liverpool, was itself fraught. Newspapers reported there were concerns as to the reception the Archbishop would receive in that most Irish of English cities, and the backlash that might lead to violence. It was suggested that destroyers might be dispatched to escort the ship into Liverpool. The Dublin Corporation, fully expecting Mannix to land in their city, passed a resolution conferring the freedom of the city on the Archbishop and appointed a deputation to meet him when he arrived. Preparations were also underway in Cork and Liverpool in case he landed there. And as previously recounted, Mannix was indeed prevented from landing in Ireland by being removed from the Baltic and taken to England and banned from travelling to Ireland or to cities in Britain with large Irish populations. Soon thereafter, the Times reported that Mannix was seeking legal advice about contesting the ban, but ultimately he did not pursue such a course. In an attempt perhaps to placate the Archbishop, Prime Minister Lloyd George told Parliament that the government was prepared to give every assistance to Archbishop Mannix's mother to visit him in England. But Mannix did not see it as an act of kindness, accusing Lloyd George of dragging the name of his elderly mother into the affair. Mannix told a reporter for the Times that he intended to press his claim to go to Ireland by every means within his power. But as events turned out, his powers were insufficient to overcome the British government's determination to prevent him doing so while the crisis in Ireland continued. This was despite representations made on the Archbishop's behalf by members of the English hierarchy and other influential persons. Once it became apparent that the ban would remain, Mannix used his time in England and his high public profile to promote the cause of Irish self-determination and to denounce British misrule in Ireland. Yet he tempered his language, particularly in the early months, speaking favourably of Dominion Home Rule as a form of government that might be acceptable as a realistic alternative to a republic in order to bring peace to Ireland. Despite its concerns as to Mannix's propensity to cause trouble, the British government handed him a golden opportunity to go on the attack. On the 12th of August, while the Archbishop was settling into his London residence following his forced removal from the Baltic, Crown forces in Ireland arrested the Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence McSweeney. In protest, McSweeney went on hunger strike, and after being tried and convicted by court-martial, he was transferred to London's Brixton prison. Mannix quickly became associated with his fellow Corkman, whose father had lived in Melbourne and is buried there. Rallies were now being called to protest against the British government's ill treatment of both Mannix and McSweeney. McSweeney's hunger strike lasted 74 days before he eventually died on the 25th of October 1920. All the while, his slow, agonising death was reported in the press around the world. Mannix first visited McSweeney in Brixton prison on the 23rd of August. He visited him again shortly before his death to give him the last rites of the church. Mannix also officiated at McSweeney's funeral, the funeral service at St George's Cathedral, Southwark, and he led the procession to Euston Station, from where his remains were taken to Ireland for burial. Despite the bad publicity, the British government did not relent on its ban on Mannix visiting Ireland, and the Archbishop eventually left England in March 1921 for his much belated visit to the Pope. He returned to England in May on his way home, but sailed for Australia without setting foot in Ireland. Mannix did eventually get to visit Ireland, but not until June 1925, after leading a pilgrimage to Rome during the Holy Year. By then, the War of Independence and the Civil War had both ended. Mannix saw himself as someone who might bring peace and reconciliation to a divided country, struggling to survive after years of bitter conflict. But he was hardly the man to undertake the role of mediator, as he was too committed to the Republican cause. Almost alone among the hierarchy in Australia and Ireland, Mannix had consistently advocated a republic. He had spoken out against the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and he had supported the Republican side during the Civil War. On arriving in Dublin, Mannix and his pilgrims were greeted by a cheering crowd estimated at 20,000 and a delegation of prominent Republicans, including De Valera. But Mannix was ignored by the Free State government and most of the Catholic hierarchy. He was even denied permission to address the students at Maynooth College, where he had served as president before his appointment to Melbourne. Colm Kiernan has claimed that prior to the Archbishop's arrival in Ireland, De Valera visited Mannix in Rome. According to Kiernan, De Valera did so to plead with Mannix not to lead the pilgrims to Ireland, but to come to Ireland, if at all, as a private individual, as the Irish hierarchy had requested. This, Kiernan argues, was because De Valera would not welcome an open breach between Mannix and the Catholic hierarchy and did not wish to give the hierarchy any reason to ignore Mannix. The Irish hierarchy had condemned the Republican cause in a joint pastoral letter issued in October 1922, and Mannix's visit in an official capacity placed the bishops in a difficult position because of his reputation as an avowed Republican. By ignoring De Valera's advice, Mannix, in Kiernan's opinion, ensured the failure of his mission for peace and reconciliation. By then, also, there was not the same personal imperative for Mannix to visit Ireland as in 1920. Mannix's mother had died in January 1925, even before the Archbishop had left Australia. And the Dublin Corporation, which in 1920 had wanted to confer on him the freedom of the city, no longer existed. The Free State government had dissolved it and appointed commissioners who were not of a mind to confer any honour on Mannix. On his travels around Ireland, Mannix made speeches critical of the treaty and of the Free State government, and accepted the freedom of cities from pro-Republican councils such as Limerick and Sligo. In many places he was warmly received, but in others he was snubbed. Even in his hometown of Charleville, he was locked out of the church, an experience, according to Kiernan, that cut deep and left a permanent scar. But some have questioned whether Republican leaders, including De Valera, would have welcomed Mannix's aggressive republicanism at that particular time. It was not 1920, and their opponents were no longer the hated Sassenach, but their Irish compatriots. Mannix had been away from Ireland for 12 years and was out of touch with the realities and needs of a nation riven by civil war. Referring to Mannix's 1925 visit to Ireland, journalist and writer Joe Broderick wrote, "Although he professed to speak for peace and for unity among the Irish people of all opinions, in fact, he was undisguisedly taking sides and reopening wounds still fresh from the recent civil war, deriding the stepping stones theory of those who defended the treaty. The Archbishop's approach was too blunt. Irish politics would be requiring men capable of more sinuous and subtle manoeuvrings." And of course, the most proficient exponent of those virtues was De Valera, who in time would ease himself back to the centre of Irish politics and dominate it for the rest of his long political career. Broderick suggests that in his heart, De Valera may have felt a certain relief at his friend's forthcoming departure. Another Mannix biographer, B.A. Santamaria, is less critical of Mannix's interventions in Ireland, arguing that it was in fact Mannix who counselled De Valera to accept the oath of allegiance and enter the Dáil, a step which he took 2 years later, though with a somewhat theatrical refusal to swear on the Bible. As the day of Mannix's departure drew near, civic leaders in Dublin found a way to honour the Archbishop, despite the City Commissioner's refusal to do so. On the 22nd of October 1925, they organised a special ceremony, which was attended by Republican supporters, including De Valera, but few others, certainly not the leaders of church and state. At the ceremony, a certificate of the freedom of the city, which had been voted for in 1920, was presented to the Archbishop in a silver casket engraved with an image of the ocean liner RMS Baltic and the Royal Navy warship HMS Wivern. It was a small consolation for the wounded sensitivities that Archbishop Mannix felt at being snubbed by the government and the clergy of his native land. Less than a fortnight later, Mannix left Ireland for Australia, never to return. As Colm Kiernan observed, he would not run the risk of being insulted by his own country twice. Yet Mannix continued to be popular with Irish Republicans and indeed broad sections of the Irish community, so much so that his memory lingered in Ireland for decades following that final visit home. In 1962, to mark the golden jubilee of his consecration as a bishop, Mannix was presented with a monstrance fashioned from a replica of the Cross of Cong, a gift from the people of Ireland. The following year, on the 6th of November 1963, Daniel Mannix died, aged 99. So there we have it. Archbishop Mannix is surely one of the most colourful characters in the history of the Irish in Australia. He's best remembered for his role in the anti-conscription referendums during the First World War and later in the 1950s over the anti-communist campaign of the Catholic social movement that resulted in the split of the Australian Labor Party. Yet for me, his contretemps with the British government and the Royal Navy in 1920 stands out as a highlight in his career. Until next time, fare thee well.